Hey folks, David Stewart here. Let's talk some more storycraft. Let's talk exposition and how the exposition occurs in Berserk by Kentaro Miura. I've covered this deluxe edition before. That's what we'll be looking at. It looks great. This is the first 3 volumes. The story picks back up at number 4. Almost the entirety of these first 3 volumes is actually exposition for the entire crazy world that Kentaro Miura developed, and it contains a type of exposition that I think works particularly well in the graphic novel format or comic format or manga format, whatever you want to call it. And that's what I call fractal exposition. This is basically where you do the same sort of indirect exposition at 3 different levels in order to show different things. So there's a short introduction to the character. This is pretty common in a lot of different graphic novel formats. Then you have a longer story and adventure that the character goes on. And then you have a much longer adventure that really develops the character and the world, the setting that the character is going through to really show you what is at stake. So that's what he does. Let's take a look at it and we'll look at some specifics. Just as a warning to anyone that's sensitive, Berserk is a very, very violent graphic novel. And as a result, it contains nudity, gore, blood, people being hacked to bits. If that's not okay with you, then you probably shouldn't watch this video and you probably shouldn't read Berserk. But I have a big fondness for this, and I think the exposition of this book is actually done very well. So let's take a look. Let's open it up. We'll go over to our very first page here. This is going to be just a 3-page exposition, which is great. Now, we already have nudity right away, so I'm really sorry if that offends some of you guys, but you had a chance to click away. So it starts with a character. We don't know him yet, and we can see a couple things about him. He's got some sort of iron hand here, and it looks like he's having sex with a woman. You get a couple of things a little bit closer, and you see this woman transforming into some sort of monster. This is the first layer here. Notice we don't have to explain a lot. We're not doing a bunch of little squares or anything to explain things like what we do. We have a nice art spread here that's quite grotesque and strange looking, as you guys can see, hopefully. And then you move right on. And I do kind of like that white there. That's an interesting, that's the fire. But it looks really good in this fully shaded spread. Then we move right on to this. So if we count that as 1 page, then we're looking at really 4 pages, but it could be up to 5 if you count that spread as 2 pages. You fell into my trap, you fool. This is your last taste of heaven before I send you to hell. And you can see her face is still inside the demon, and he's grabbing it, and then he says, the only one trapped is you, bitch. And then we have this effect here, which is going to be shh, and he blows her away. You see her completely dead here, and you see him throwing his cape around, swishing his cape, and just a wordlessness here. Now, the whole point of this, after this we move on to the first real story. The whole point of this is to really pique your interest. It's to introduce you to a very interesting character. And there's a couple things that make this character very appealing. First of all, he's kind of frightening looking. He has what looks like a false arm. We don't know what kills her right away. We see that he has a cannon in his arm later. That becomes important. But we see these really frightening demons, and we see him killing the demons. So seeing a character do something really badass really makes you want to know more about that character. This is a great introduction to like an anti-hero type character. Rather than him doing something virtuous, he's doing something against something which is evil, which is pretty much just as good, but it's really an anti-hero thing. It's not so much a standard virtuous hero thing. Next, we move on to the first real story, and we have what amounts to much more standard art. It's daytime, things are bright, the line art's very crisp and clear, and we have Guts, our character that we saw in the original one, rolling into town. We still don't know his name yet, but we see him basically do a save the cat moment. So this save the cat moment is where he ends up saving this little elf here that's being tortured by these bad guys. And so he comes out and he shoots this bad guy in the head, and that's the end of him. He kills some other guys here, and we have some great drama shots of him. He instigates the conflict himself. This is a little bit different than what you get with a standard story. Most stories, you have the hero reacting to a conflict which is instigated outside of him. In this case, Guts himself is instigating the conflict, which I like a lot. He's coming into town with the express purpose of starting trouble. And then you finally get to see that giant sword of his. Each of these frames, each of these pages is designed to show you a piece of what's important about the IP. Guts' attitude, the fact that he is very, very ruthless with his violent acts. We actually kind of like ruthlessness if we feel like it's justified. First of all, we do think he's an interesting and badass character for the ruthlessness, but once we get the idea that he's on a quest for justice, he moves from having an anti-hero introduction to really being a true hero. We end up really liking him. And we start to really appreciate the virtues that he has. And he has one particular virtue, which is just an undying, unwavering will to do what he wants to do. We have this very classic thing: massive, thick, heavy, and far too rough. Indeed, it was like a heap of raw iron. It was much too big to be called a sword. So this is all great stuff. Once we get going on the story, we have the save the cat moment to bring in this comic relief character who has some important things. We need Puck around to really talk to Guts, to let him talk to the audience. So he needs to tell the audience about himself, who he is. He needs to have some dialogue that really shows who he is, and that's what we accomplish here with Puck. And as the years have gone on, when I first read this, I was like, this little fairy's kind of dumb. But as the years have gone on, I've actually come to appreciate this funny little sidekick as something that is funny on its own, but also something that really serves. It's kind of like C-3PO in Star Wars, or one of these other slightly neurotic sidekicks. He gets in the way. He doesn't really contribute to the story. He doesn't do that much, but he does bounce things off of the protagonist and allow you to have some exposition of the protagonist you may not otherwise have, or to kind of state the obvious for how different kinds of story elements are going to go. So we see him get captured. This story runs for almost I think it runs for about 83 pages. So it's a very substantial story. It basically has Guts being let loose and attacking this lord who transforms into a monster. So he transforms from a very ugly looking dude here, a very monstrous looking dude on a scary horse who eats flesh, to a full-on monster that Guts can then chop in half. First, we finally get to see him blow his arm up, so we hinted at that his arm, there's something about his arm that, how did this demon get blown up? Oh, he has a cannon in his arm. We finally get to see that, and we get to see him kill the demon. So since we've had at the beginning a woman transform into a demon, that is set up so when he transforms into a demon, it's not that big of a surprise. It's just part of the world. Once this story concludes, we have a reflection here by the sidekick. He's Berserk. He just is relentless with what he does. He's completely destroyed this entire city in order to kill this demon. For almost the entirety of the rest of this volume, which would comprise almost 3 of these normal size volumes, he's doing more or less the same story again. It's just a more complex version of the story that shows off more of who he is as a character and goes through even darker things and shows more of how the demons work. So we have an exposition of Guts, and then in the next one we really have more exposition of how the demons work. And Kentaro Miura does this by telling a story rather than by just telling you how things are. You're going through this extremely bloody, very extreme adventure, seeing these grotesque things, and the visuals are really important to showing just how frightening and horrible the monsters that he's fighting really are. It's an extremely important element to Berserk. Until finally you get to the conclusion of that, we have lots of exposition for how the world works. So if you think about the first little introduction, it's just to make you interested in who the character is. The first story is to tell you who the character is, to teach you who Guts is. The second story, which is much longer, is to teach you not only who Guts is, but who he's fighting against, the nature of the world. And indeed, we see this. He goes through everything to destroy this monster, and at the very end, we have Griffith appear. Griffith! And that's when we know really what Guts is all about. this is important for him to do this because, like I said, Guts is not a passive character. Guts is an active character. That's one of the things that we like about him. Most stories with traditional heroes, the hero's reactive. A bad guy comes into town and robs the bank, the hero has to go react. In this case, it's Guts rolling into town, searching for his enemies, intending to destroy them, willing to do anything to have his revenge. So that really concludes that story, and you can see it's quite a bit. It's a lot of story here before you get to the end. And then once we get to the end, now we're going to backfill. When we get to the end of this, then we get to start over with our Golden Age arc, which is most people's favorite arc. But we have to set up the stakes of what's going on and where he gets there before we go there. Otherwise, we're not going to be quite as interested. If we start with just a little boy, on the battlefield, we're not going to feel quite as attached to this. We really want to know how this crying baby ends up becoming this huge man wielding a giant sword, chopping demons in half. We really want to know that journey. So like a lot of epic fiction, Berserk starts in media res. It starts in the middle of things and then goes from there. So that's the Fractal Exposition of Berserk. It happens at 3 levels. A 4 or 5 page introduction to the character to pique your interest, a longer story that tells you more about the character and reveals to you some of his motives and what he's doing, and then finally a story that really tells you all about the world, what's at stake, who he's really trying to get to, what Guts' real intentions are. It does this all indirectly, which is great, and it's great for the graphic novel format. If you can imagine, if you were doing, say, floppy comics, you'd have your first comic be that introduction to the character, and then you'd have maybe a series after that would be a longer adventure, and then you might have a longer series where you really get to plumb the depths of what's going on. So a lot of comics will use this format, and Kentaro Miura does, I think, a really, really good job with introducing the story. It's really carries a whole lot of weight because there's been some volumes much later in the series that just are a little slow compared to these early volumes, but really does a good job with it to make us interested in the long term. So thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Of course, I write books. Eyes on the Walls is the newest one. This one I think you can still get for free. This is a high fantasy novel. If you join my mailing list, and Crown of Sight is also 99 cents. Also high fantasy. If you want something that is darker fantasy, that's probably going to be City of Silver and Crown of Sight. Both of these are fairly close on the dark fantasy levels. Not quite as gory as Berserk, but definitely a little darker. So thanks so much, and I'll see you guys next time.